If you walk through the streets of Buenos Aires today, you will see the elegant facades of European-style buildings lining the grand boulevards, remnants of an era when Argentina was among the 10 wealthiest nations on Earth. You will see cafes where old men still argue about politics over espresso, their voices carrying the weight of 100 betrayals. You will see the ghostly outlines of shuttered factories in the industrial suburbs, monuments to jobs that vanished overnight. But what you will not see is any foreign army of occupation. There are no tanks stationed on the corners. There are no soldiers patrolling the plazas. The conquest was completed without a single bullet being fired. In the gleaming headquarters of the International Monetary Fund at 719th Street in Washington, D.C., economists in expensive suits speak a language of technical precision, of fiscal consolidation and structural benchmarks and debt sustainability analyses. They present themselves as doctors treating sick economies, as neutral technocrats applying the universal laws of sound finance. They do not present themselves as what they actually are. They are the administrators of an empire that operates through spreadsheets instead of soldiers, through loan conditions instead of colonial governors, through debt instead of direct occupation. The nations that have passed through the IMF's doors seeking help have emerged transformed, but rarely in the ways they expected or hoped. Their public assets have been sold to foreign investors at fire sale prices. Their social programs have been gutted in the name of fiscal discipline. Their currencies have been devalued into worthlessness. Their governments have become answerable not to their own citizens who elected them, but to creditors who sit in distant capitals and demand payment before all other priorities can be addressed. They believed they were borrowing money to solve a temporary problem. They did not understand they were selling their sovereignty permanently. This is the story of the IMF trap, the most sophisticated mechanism of economic control ever devised by human ingenuity. It does not conquer through invasion. It conquers through rescue. It does not demand tribute at the point of a gun. It demands structural adjustment as a condition of survival. This is how nations are bankrupted, populations impoverished, and futures foreclosed, all in the name of economic medicine prescribed by doctors who never suffer from the cure. To understand the IMF trap, we must first understand the institution itself, its origins, its governance structure, and the ideology that animates its every action. The International Monetary Fund was created at the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, when representatives of 44 nations gathered in the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire to design the post-war economic order from scratch. The official purpose was noble: to promote international monetary cooperation, to stabilize exchange rates that had fluctuated wildly during the Depression, and to provide temporary financing to countries facing balance of payments problems. It sounded benevolent. It sounded like exactly what a war-ravaged world desperately needed. But the IMF was never designed to be a neutral institution serving all nations equally, despite its multilateral presentation. Its voting structure was weighted by financial contributions, which meant that wealthy nations controlled every significant decision. The United States alone held enough votes to veto any major policy change. European nations collectively held another blocking share. The developing world, which would eventually become the IMF's primary patient population, had almost no voice in determining the treatment they would receive. The doctors would prescribe medicine according to their own theories and interests, and the patients would swallow it without question or face exclusion from the global economy. For the first 2 decades of its existence, the IMF operated relatively quietly in the background of international finance, managing currency adjustments and providing short-term liquidity to developed nations facing temporary difficulties. Britain borrowed from the fund in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. France borrowed in 1958 to stabilize the franc. These were discrete transactions between financial equals, embarrassing perhaps for national pride, but not fundamentally transformative of the borrowing nations. The IMF's true nature as an instrument of economic control would only be revealed when it turned its full attention to the developing world. The transformation began in the turbulent 1970s with the oil crisis and the subsequent explosion of Third World debt. When oil prices quadrupled in 1973, petroleum-exporting countries found themselves awash in dollars they could not possibly spend on their own development. These petrodollars flowed into Western banks, which needed to lend them out aggressively to earn returns for their shareholders. The banks looked south, to Latin America, to Africa, and to Asia, and found governments eager to borrow for ambitious development projects. The loans came easily in those heady years, with few questions asked about repayment capacity and fewer conditions attached to their use. Then came August 1982 and the Mexican debt crisis that sent shockwaves through the foundations of the global financial system. Suddenly, the developing world owed over $500 billion to commercial banks in New York and London, and much of that debt had become clearly unpayable. The banks faced catastrophic losses that could destroy them. The Reagan administration faced the prospect of a cascading financial system collapse. Someone needed to manage this crisis to ensure that the debts would be serviced even if they could never be fully repaid. The IMF stepped forward eagerly with a new role and a new set of powerful tools. The man who would codify the IMF's ideological approach was an economist named John Williamson. In 1989, Williamson published an influential paper describing what he called the Washington Consensus, a set of 10 policy prescriptions that the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S. Treasury all agreed were essential for any developing country seeking financial assistance. The prescriptions included fiscal discipline, tax reform, interest rate liberalization, competitive exchange rates, trade liberalization, openness to foreign investment, privatization of state enterprises, deregulation of markets, and secure property rights for investors. Presented as neutral technical economics based on universal principles, it was actually a comprehensive ideology, a blueprint for transforming mixed economies with state involvement into pure market systems fully open to foreign capital penetration. The Washington Consensus became the catechism of the IMF, the creed its missionaries would spread across the globe. Every country that came seeking help would be required to adopt these policies as non-negotiable conditions of receiving funds. It did not matter if the country was in Africa or Asia or Latin America. It did not matter if the crisis was caused by external shocks beyond the country's control or by internal mismanagement. The prescription was always the same: cut government spending, privatize state assets, open markets to imports, and pay your debts before anything else. The medicine never varied because the purpose was not primarily to cure the patient. The purpose was to reshape the patient's economy in ways that served creditor interests above all else. The mechanics of the IMF trap can be illustrated with painful clarity through the story of Jamaica, a Caribbean island nation that became one of the fund's earliest and most thoroughly subjugated patients. In 1972, Michael Manley was elected prime minister on a platform of democratic socialism and genuine economic independence from colonial-era arrangements. He wanted to build schools and hospitals for ordinary Jamaicans. He wanted to redistribute land from the vast plantations still owned by descendants of colonial families. He wanted to give working people a stake in their own country's mineral wealth. To finance these ambitious programs, Jamaica borrowed from international banks during the easy money years of the mid-1970s. When commodity prices collapsed and interest rates soared at the end of the decade, Jamaica could no longer service its growing debts. Manley went to the IMF in 1977, seeking a bridge loan to navigate what he believed was a temporary crisis. What he received instead was a comprehensive set of conditions that would systematically dismantle everything his government had tried to build. The IMF demanded that Jamaica devalue its currency, the Jamaican dollar, by 50% against the US dollar. Overnight, imports became twice as expensive in local currency terms. Since Jamaica imported most of its food, fuel, and manufactured goods, the cost of living for ordinary Jamaicans effectively doubled immediately. The IMF demanded that Jamaica eliminate food subsidies that kept basic staples affordable for the poorest citizens. The price of bread, rice, cooking oil, and other essentials skyrocketed beyond the reach of families who had barely been surviving. The IMF demanded that Jamaica freeze public sector wages, even as inflation was rapidly eating away at workers' purchasing power. Teachers, nurses, police officers, and civil servants saw their real incomes collapse to a fraction of their previous value. The IMF demanded that Jamaica open its markets completely to foreign goods, eliminating the tariffs that protected local farmers and manufacturers from overwhelming competition. Cheaper imports flooded in from larger economies, destroying domestic industries that had provided employment for generations. Between 1977 and 1980, Jamaica signed 3 separate agreements with the IMF, each one imposing harsher conditions than the last as the previous programs failed to produce the promised results. Each time Jamaica failed to meet the fund's macroeconomic targets, because the targets were often designed to be unachievable given the conditions, The next agreement would demand even deeper cuts to public services and wages. By 1980, Manley's government had been forced to abandon virtually every policy it had been democratically elected to implement. The Jamaican people responded to this disappointment by voting him out of office, replacing him with Edward Seaga, a conservative who promised to work constructively with the IMF rather than resist its prescriptions. But working cooperatively with the IMF proved no more successful than fighting against it. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Jamaica remained trapped in an endless cycle of borrowing, austerity, economic contraction, and deeper borrowing to cover the shortfalls. The country's total debt grew relentlessly from $900 million in 1977 to over $4 billion by 1990 and continued climbing thereafter. The interest payments alone consumed over half of the government's entire revenue. There was no money left for building schools. There was no money for staffing hospitals. There was no money for maintaining roads. There was no money for anything except servicing debts that could never be fully repaid. Jamaica had become a plantation once again, except now the master was not a colonial governor residing in Kingston, but an international financial institution headquartered in Washington. The pattern established in Jamaica was replicated across the developing world with numbing consistency over the following decades. Ghana, which had been one of the most promising African nations at independence in 1957, submitted to IMF structural adjustment in 1983 after years of economic decline. The fund demanded aggressive privatization of state enterprises, and Ghanaian assets that had been built with public funds were sold to foreign investors at small fractions of their real value. The fund demanded introduction of user fees for healthcare and education that had previously been free, and school enrollment dropped precipitously as families could no longer afford to send their children. The fund demanded reorientation toward export-oriented agriculture, and farmers abandoned food crops that fed local populations to grow cocoa for European chocolate companies, while ordinary Ghanaians went hungry. In Zambia, the story was even more brutal and immediate in its human impact. The IMF demanded the removal of government subsidies on maize meal, the staple food that provided most calories for the Zambian poor. In December 1986, when the government reluctantly complied with this condition, the price of food doubled overnight without any corresponding increase in wages. Riots erupted immediately in the Copper Belt cities where unemployed miners and their families faced starvation. President Kenneth Kaunda was forced to restore the subsidies to prevent civil breakdown, but the IMF responded by suspending the entire loan program. Zambia was caught in an impossible position between feeding its people and satisfying its international creditors. It discovered that it could not do both simultaneously. Think carefully about what structural adjustment actually meant for an ordinary family living in these countries. A father who had worked for a state-owned enterprise for 20 years would suddenly lose his job when the company was privatized, and the new foreign owners immediately cut costs by firing local workers. A mother who had received free health care at a public clinic would now face fees she could not afford, so she would not seek treatment when she fell ill and would die from treatable conditions. Children who had attended public schools would be forced to drop out because their parents could no longer pay for uniforms, books, and newly imposed tuition fees. Any savings the family had managed to accumulate would be wiped out by currency devaluation. This was not abstract macroeconomics. This was the systematic destruction of human lives in the name of financial orthodoxy imposed from abroad. By the mid-1990s, the evidence of structural adjustment's failure to produce its promised benefits was overwhelming to anyone who cared to look. A landmark UNICEF report documented that IMF and World Bank programs had led directly to increased child mortality rates across sub-Saharan Africa. A study conducted by the World Bank's own economists found that countries operating under IMF programs actually grew more slowly than comparable countries that had avoided the fund's embrace. The critics grew louder and more numerous. The protests at IMF meetings grew larger and more disruptive. But the institution continued applying the same prescriptions decade after decade, because the prescriptions were never really designed to help debtor countries develop. They were designed to ensure that creditors in wealthy nations would be repaid, regardless of the human cost to populations in poor ones. The true face of the IMF trap was revealed with devastating clarity in Argentina at the turn of the millennium, a crisis so profound and so well documented that it would reshape global debates about international finance for a generation. Argentina had been the model student of the Washington Consensus, the example the IMF pointed to when critics questioned its approach. Throughout the 1990s, under President Carlos Menem, the country had faithfully implemented every reform the fund prescribed with enthusiasm. It privatized state enterprises aggressively, selling the national airline, the telephone company, the oil fields, the railway system, and even the pension system to foreign investors. It pegged its currency, the peso, to the US dollar at a fixed 1-to-1 exchange rate, a policy the IMF championed as the unshakable foundation of financial stability. The IMF showered Argentina with praise and loans in equal measure. Between 1991 and 2001, the fund provided over $50 billion in financing to support Argentina's reform program. Mitchell Camdesis, the IMF's managing director, repeatedly held up Argentina as proof that structural adjustment worked when properly implemented. In the corridors of the fund's Washington headquarters, Argentina was the success story officials could point to when skeptics questioned whether their approach would ever produce positive results. But beneath the impressive surface of macroeconomic statistics, the Argentine economy was being systematically hollowed out by the very policies that were supposed to be strengthening it. The currency peg that the IMF had celebrated was actually a ticking time bomb with a fuse that grew shorter every year. With the peso permanently locked to the dollar, Argentine exports became increasingly expensive compared to competitors like Brazil, whose currencies could depreciate. The trade deficit widened steadily year after year. To maintain the rigid peg, Argentina had to borrow dollars continuously from international markets, piling up external debts that grew larger with each passing quarter. By 2001, the country's external debt had reached $140 billion, an obligation that could never realistically be repaid from export earnings that were actually shrinking. The tipping point arrived in December 2001. The government of President Fernando de la Rua, desperate to maintain the currency peg that the IMF insisted was essential, took the extraordinary step of freezing all bank accounts to prevent capital flight. Ordinary Argentines woke up one morning to discover they could not access their own savings, money they had deposited in banks trusting that it would be safe. Millions of people who had followed all the rules, who had worked hard and saved for their futures, were suddenly unable to withdraw a single peso. The measure was called the corralito, the little corral, as if the Argentine people were livestock being penned in for financial slaughter. Riots exploded across the country within hours. In Buenos Aires, enormous crowds gathered in the historic Plaza de Mayo, banging pots and pans in a cacophonous protest that came to be known as the cacerolazo, the sound of a nation's anger. Police responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. Violence escalated rapidly. 27 people were killed in the unrest over several days. President de la Rua resigned in disgrace and fled the presidential palace by helicopter, the humiliating image of his escape broadcast around the world on live television. In the political chaos that followed, Argentina would cycle through 5 different presidents in just 2 weeks as the political system collapsed alongside the economy. On December 23, 2001, interim President Adolfo Rodriguez Saá made the announcement that would have been unthinkable for a country that had followed IMF prescriptions so faithfully for so long. Argentina would default on its foreign debt, the largest sovereign default in world history at that time. $95 billion in bonds held by investors around the world would simply not be paid. The peso was unpegged from the dollar and immediately collapsed in value, losing 70% of its purchasing power within weeks. The middle class that had believed in the promises of reform watched their dollar-denominated savings converted to worthless pesos overnight. Everything they had worked for was gone. The human cost was staggering beyond any statistical summary. Unemployment reached 25% of the workforce. More than half the entire population fell below the official poverty line in a country that had once been among the world's wealthiest. Malnutrition and hunger reappeared in a nation that was simultaneously one of the world's largest exporters of food. Families who had lived in comfortable middle-class homes found themselves scavenging through garbage dumps for recyclable materials they could sell for a few pesos. An entire generation of educated young Argentines emigrated permanently, taking their talents and their futures to Spain, Italy, and the United States. The country that the IMF had celebrated as its greatest success story had become its most spectacular and undeniable failure. But the creditors and their institutional representatives had absolutely no intention of changing their fundamental approach based on one catastrophic failure, however undeniable. The Argentine crisis was followed within a decade by an even more dramatic demonstration of the IMF trap in Greece, a member of the European Union, a founding participant in Western civilization, a developed nation that was supposed to be immune to the kind of financial colonization that had devastated the Third World for generations. Greece proved definitively that no country, regardless of its history or its membership in powerful alliances, was truly safe from the mechanisms of debt-based control. The Greek crisis erupted in October 2009, when the newly elected government of Prime Minister George Papandreou revealed to shocked European partners that previous administrations had been systematically hiding the true extent of the country's fiscal problems with accounting tricks. The budget deficit was not 4% of GDP as officially reported to the European Commission. It was closer to 13%, a figure that made Greece's continued membership in the Eurozone immediately questionable. The debt markets panicked. Interest rates on Greek government bonds spiked to levels that made further market borrowing completely impossible. Greece faced immediate default and potential exclusion from the entire European financial system. The Troika arrived to administer what they called a rescue, but what would become the most severe austerity program ever imposed on a developed nation. The European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund formed an unprecedented partnership to impose conditions on a European member state. The bailout packages they offered, 110 billion euros initially in May 2010, then a second bailout of 130 billion in 2012, and eventually a third bailout in 2015, came with conditions that would have been grimly familiar to any Jamaican or Argentine or Ghanaian who had lived through structural adjustment. The prescription was identical, only the patient had changed. Pensions that Greek workers had earned over lifetimes of labor were slashed by up to 40%, plunging retirees into sudden poverty. Public sector wages were cut by 30% while workloads increased. The minimum wage was reduced by 22%, making it impossible for young workers to afford independent lives. The retirement age was raised repeatedly. Public hospitals were closed and consolidated. Schools were merged and teachers dismissed. The social safety net that Greeks had built over generations of democratic governance was systematically shredded to satisfy the demands of foreign creditors. The birthplace of democracy was being administered by technocrats who answered to Frankfurt and Washington, not Athens. Consider the mechanics of the Greek bailout with clear and unsentimental eyes. The money provided did not go to Greek people or Greek public services or Greek development. Over 90% of the bailout funds flowed directly through the Greek government and immediately back out again, to German and French banks that had lent recklessly to Greece during the good years and now faced massive losses. The bailouts rescued the creditors, not the country. Greece was left holding the enlarged debt, which had been increased by the bailout loans themselves, while the original private lenders were made completely whole at European taxpayer expense. It was a transfer of liability from reckless private banks to public institutions, with Greece trapped permanently as the debtor who would pay for generations. The Greek economy collapsed more severely than the American economy had during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Between 2008 and 2016, Greek GDP fell by over 25%, a contraction unprecedented in peacetime for any developed economy. Unemployment reached 27% of the workforce overall and exceeded 60% among young people under 25. Suicide rates doubled from their pre-crisis levels. Infant mortality increased for the first time in decades as healthcare systems broke down. Greeks who had worked productively their entire lives saw their pensions cut repeatedly, their lifetime savings wiped out by bank restructuring, their adult children forced to emigrate to find any work at all. In July 2015, the Greek people voted in a national referendum, rejecting by a decisive 61% the austerity terms demanded by the Troika. It was an extraordinary act of democratic defiance against financial power. For one brief shining moment, it seemed that a nation might actually say no to the IMF trap, might prioritize the welfare of its own people over the demands of its creditors. But within a single week, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras had capitulated completely, accepting terms even harsher than those the Greek voters had just rejected. The message was delivered with perfect clarity. Democracy was irrelevant to this process. The debts would be paid regardless of how people voted, regardless of which party won elections, regardless of what the population wanted or needed. The extraction from Greece was systematic, comprehensive, and ongoing. State assets were transferred to a special privatization fund controlled by creditors rather than the Greek government, to be sold off to raise cash for debt payments. The 14 regional airports were privatized and sold to a German company. The port of Piraeus, one of the largest in the Mediterranean and a strategic national asset, was sold to a Chinese shipping conglomerate. Beaches, islands, and public buildings were put on the auction block. The birthplace of Western civilization was being sold off piece by piece to satisfy foreign bondholders who had gambled and lost, but who were being made whole anyway at Greek expense. The IMF trap continues to operate today across the developing world with undiminished efficiency, claiming new victims with each passing year. Pakistan has been under IMF programs for most of its independent history, perpetually borrowing, perpetually adjusting, never escaping the cycle, never developing. Egypt received a $12 billion loan in 2016 that required floating its currency, which promptly lost half its value and plunged additional millions of Egyptians into poverty. Sri Lanka's spectacular economic collapse in 2022, which led to the president fleeing the country by military aircraft as protesters stormed his palace, followed a pattern that any careful student of IMF history would recognize immediately. The names of countries and leaders change. The locations shift across the map, but the trap remains fundamentally the same. The story of the IMF trap is the ultimate lesson in the power of financial architecture and conditionality over political sovereignty. The architects of this system understood clearly after World War II that direct colonial control was no longer politically acceptable in the emerging era of national liberation. They understood that military occupation generated resistance and required ongoing expense and constant vigilance. But debt created a form of control that was nearly invisible to those who suffered under it, a form of control that the victims often imposed on themselves. A country that owes money must earn that money by producing what creditors want to buy. It must organize its entire economy to generate dollars or euros, not to feed its own people, or educate its own children, or develop its own potential. The priorities of distant creditors become the binding priorities of the nation. The nations caught in this system believed they were making temporary compromises to navigate temporary difficulties. They did not understand that the difficulties were in many cases created or exacerbated by design. They did not understand that the compromises would become permanent features of their governance. They did not understand that the trap would close around them gradually and then completely. The creditors proved through decades of practice that the most effective way to control a country is not to invade it with visible armies that might face resistance, but to lend to it with invisible conditions that reshape every aspect of economic and political life. But the history of the IMF also teaches us that no system of extraction operates forever without eventually generating organized resistance. Countries are exploring alternatives. Bilateral lending from China through the Belt and Road Initiative without ideological conditions, regional monetary arrangements that bypass the dollar, digital currencies, barter agreements between nations. The dollar's dominance and the IMF's authority are being questioned as never before. When we watch nations struggle under IMF programs, we should remember that these struggles are not accidents or policy failures. They are the intended outcomes of a system designed in Washington to serve creditor interests. Remember that the language of economic medicine and structural adjustment conceals a reality of control and wealth extraction. Remember that bankruptcy without bullets is still conquest. The marble atrium of the IMF headquarters in Washington displays today the flags of 190 member nations. It is presented as a symbol of international cooperation and shared purpose and collective commitment to global prosperity. It is actually a trophy case, displaying the colors of nations that have surrendered their economic sovereignty to an institution whose decisions they cannot influence. The delegates who created the IMF at Bretton Woods believed they were building a system to prevent financial crises. They built a system that manufactures them. Economic sovereignty is national sovereignty. If you control the budget, you control the country. If you own the debt, you own the debtor.